the BBC. I honestly, I have to pay people to watch television because I don't watch that much myself. So I'm just not in a position to say. I apologise if that sounds glib, but it would be wrong of me to try to compare. I think that what I would ask back to you is, do you think that the BBC has a better reputation than CNN and is more trusted around the world? And I would think in most countries around the world, people think CNN is somehow a voice of America, and the BBC is a voice of truth. I think that's the fundamental difference. But the reason I'm not talking about privatisation plainly, because I agree with you that the BBC is by no means the worst offender. There are many others far worse, and the BBC might in fact be one of the better opinion formers around. There are very good elements about the BBC. Most particularly is the Charter. The fact is that there are producers' guidelines which contractually oblige the BBC to produce fair reporting. There's very few other news providers that have that obligation. It's a precious jewel which we should hang on to. What I'm saying is, within the context of retaining that obligation, let's have a bit of competition. Let's parcel the money out to a few different broadcasters. Let the broadcasters know they could lose the franchise to somebody else next year. And that will create an actual competition to be the fairest broadcaster, which at the moment we don't have. And at the same time, it would break up the monopoly and break up the arrogance and the self-confidence. Plus, my suggested formula of something of a break-up of this monopoly also goes alongside the other factor, and in my view the first factor, which is a very strong, independent governing body or regulator, judicially trained, outside the BBC, separately funded, with a separate career path, a separate form of honours system, and with the real power to change the BBC. And that, I think, is the first and absolutely essential step.
Rona, and last question thereafter, Izzy Leibler.
Just talk.
Well, okay. Basically, to follow up on Gamma's question, you mainly focus in brilliant analysis on why does the BBC do what they do, or do they do what they do? And your answer is because they can. There's no system of accountability whatsoever. I would like to know what is your take, your impression on the broader question of, I mean, they can do what they do, that's a more institutional answer. But on the broader issue of the culture of the BBC, why is it that they are so tempted to forge such opinions? And this is indeed very broad, but just to hear your thoughts on it.
I think one can simplify your question, and this is making it a banal question. Is the BBC anti-Semitic? You're not really asking that. You're asking a more subtle question. I certainly don't believe that there is a uniform view within the BBC. It's too chaotic and too large to have a uniform view. But I think that in any institution, a culture develops. And if you are in the position, as I am at work, of employing somebody, I suspect that if somebody with political views, if two candidates for a job were in front of me, and one had political views which I found abhorrent, and the other one was someone who I thought was a perfectly pleasant individual, I would likely go against the person who I found abhorrent, even though they were just as good a lawyer as the other person. And I think that's a natural human instinct. And if you are in a powerful position and have the sort of liberal left viewpoint, you are likely to recreate that in the staff below you. And so the entire institution becomes full of people that have a similar viewpoint. Or those that have different viewpoints, and I've spoken to quite a lot of people in the BBC, almost all of them Jewish, who say that it's an almost intolerable situation for them to mention anything to do with the Middle East. They basically have to stay off the topic because they would get pilloried by their peers, and probably ultimately their positions would become untenable because the culture is so anti-Israel within the BBC. But I don't think that this is necessarily militated by anti-Semitism. I think it leads to it, because if everybody only gets a very negative message of Jews, then they'll end up not liking Jews. I mean, the same would be the case if, you know, of any group. So it's very dangerous. But I would say that essentially that is part of the problem. Another reason to break it up is because you have an institutional culture which you can't change any more than you can change. I mean, within the police force in the UK, time and again they've tried to stamp out racism. But, you know, if you're black, you have something like 94% more chance of being arrested than if you're white in the UK. Because it's institutionally racist in the police. And I think the BBC is institutionally soft left, anti-Israel, anti-war, anti-America, etc., etc., etc.
Last question, easy.
I think we all owe you, Jews throughout the world owe you a great debt, because the work that you've done here has set the foundations for what I think is going to be a long-term, very, very serious problem that we have to face up to. And by giving this analysis, you've kind of laid out some foundations. But let me say to you that everything I've heard from you today confirms that the only way, and I speak as someone that's involved practically in the political level, the only way we're going to make any movement in this way is by direct political confrontation, public opinion. And to some extent you reflect the views that were expressed by the Chief Rabbi in the article I read in the Jerusalem Post, when you say that, when he said that there has to be a certain amount of understatement rather than geschrei. And here, I feel, is the big problem with European Jews, that they don't realize that when one is fighting this sort of prejudice, and I'll go a bit further and I'll say that today in Europe, the sickness of Europe is that anti-Semitism has been translated into a form of anti-Zionism, and where you draw the line is very, very grey, I agree. Double standards, of course, and applying attitudes towards Israel that they don't apply anywhere else, and I think the BBC reflects the worst of Europe in that context. But the point I'm making is there's only one way that we're going to get through to public opinion, even in a country of understatement of England, and that is by brutally shaming and exposing. And Daniel Doron started, I don't know if he's still, yes, he's still here. I must say, I echo his sentiments, and I think that the understatement, when there is a clear case of the sort of thing that you've exposed here today, we shouldn't hold back. We have to be terribly careful not to exaggerate a case, but in terms of confronting, I think that shaming is the only way that we'll get a change in public opinion. And I don't know whether you agree with that, but that's a different culture, perhaps.
That's a nice last question.
I think you're accusing me of being pusillanimous and shy to stand up and be counted, for which I hope I'm not guilty of that. I do agree that European Jewry and certainly Anglo Jewry has been supine in its response, and it's pathetic, it's sad, and it needs to be given a massive kick. You're right, we do need to scream from the rooftops. We do need to shout and rail and complain loudly and be heard. But I think that the word, the expression "to be heard" is important. If we rant, if we speak the wrong language, then we will not be heard. If we are waving banners outside the House of Commons and jumping up and down, screeching, there is a place for that, and I think it should be done to a degree. But the people will write that in England, you will get written off as a lunatic if you do that. You have to express yourself in the way that English people can understand in order to be heard in England. Now, I'm not saying that I've got that balance right at all, and one's constantly having to adjust the way in which you put the message across in order to get the message across. But I think that it's very important. I absolutely agree that the Anglo-Jewish community is far too sleepy. We've got to wake up. We've got to do something. We've got to take very aggressive and very, very firm action. And in essence, I entirely agree with your thought.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I regret that today we didn't bring the BBC down, but we still may do. I would like those of you who are not regulars here, who want to get at least our written material. Here is Elizabeth Maimon. She'll take down your emails, and you can get our post-Holocaust and anti-Semitism material by email every month. Thanks so much to Trevor for having taken the trouble and for all he has done to the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, really on all our behalf, because you have done what the institutions should have done. Thank you so much. As said, on the Jerusalem Viewpoint Standard you can find the interview with him, which was the base for this conversation today, and Carol Solomon will lecture here on the 1st of March at 10 o'clock. Good.
שלום. שלום. הכל בסדר? גם האוסטרלים?
You have left your email.